This report is based on publicly available information from reputable outlets as of the 28th of January 2026, 12 UTC. Some details may change as new facts emerge. Death toll figures vary significantly between sources. On January 26, 2026, the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier strike group arrived in the Middle East, positioning itself within striking distance of Iran. This development marks one of the most dangerous escalations between the United States and Iran in years, coming amid a crisis that has already claimed thousands of lives and pushed the Iranian economy to the brink of total collapse. The situation is unprecedented. According to the U.S.-based human rights activists news agency, as of January 27, at least 6,126 people have been killed since protests erupted on December 28. However, this figure tells only part of the story. Independent estimates range dramatically higher, with some sources citing death tolls exceeding 30,000 people. Iran's government acknowledges just 3,117 deaths, calling most victims civilians and security forces while labeling the rest terrorists. President Donald Trump has threatened military intervention, describing what he calls a massive fleet heading toward Iran, while Tehran has warned of ferocious retaliation if attacked. But this isn't just another Middle East tension story. Iran's currency, the rial, collapsed to a record low of 1.5 million to the dollar on January 27, effectively rendering people's life savings worthless. Major international airlines suspended flights across the region weeks ago and still haven't resumed operations. The skies remain cleared, military assets continue positioning, and the internet blackout that began on January 8th has now entered its third week, making this one of the longest communications shutdowns in modern history. What makes this crisis different from past confrontations? Why are commercial airlines treating this situation with unprecedented caution even now? And most critically, are we witnessing the build-up to another major military conflict in the Middle East, or is this high-stakes brinkmanship that could still be resolved through diplomacy? In the next several minutes, I'll break down exactly what's happening on the ground in Iran, detail the massive military movements that just reached the region, explain why this crisis escalated so rapidly, and analyze what might happen in the coming days. This is a developing situation with global implications that could reshape the Middle East. The current crisis began on December 28, 2025, when protests erupted in Iran's capital, Tehran. Initially sparked by economic grievances and the catastrophic collapse of the Iranian rial's value, demonstrations quickly spread to all 31 provinces and evolved into nationwide anti-government upheaval on a scale Iran hasn't witnessed since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The timeline of events moved with alarming speed. In late December 2025, protests began with Tehran bazaar merchants demonstrating over the country's failing economy. Inflation had peaked at more than 42% according to International Monetary Fund data, and the rial was already in free fall. The demonstrations rapidly expanded beyond economic concerns to include broader political grievances against the government, with protesters demanding fundamental political change. Then came January 8th and 9th, 2026, the 2 days that transformed this into a historic tragedy. According to multiple independent sources, these 48 hours saw the most intense violence, with estimates ranging from 12,000 to 30,000 people killed largely during this brief period. Iranian security forces dramatically escalated their use of live ammunition against demonstrators. Hospitals in Tehran, Shiraz, and other major cities were overwhelmed by injured protesters suffering gunshot wounds, many shot from behind while fleeing. Medical sources reported that victims showed bullet entry wounds through the backs of their heads, indicating security forces were firing on people as they ran away. Simultaneously, at 2200 hours local time on January 8th, Iran implemented what human rights organizations describe as a near-total internet shutdown, cutting off 99% of the country's internet access, according to NetBlocks, an independent monitoring organization. This blackout prevented documentation of the crackdown and isolated Iranians from the outside world. Even internal communications within Iran's national information network were disrupted. The shutdown has now lasted more than 2.5 weeks, making it one of the longest internet blackouts in modern history, exceeded only by Sudan's 25-day shutdown following its October 2021 coup. Between January 13th and 14th, President Trump issued warnings that Iran would be wiped off the face of this earth if it ever succeeded in assassinating the U.S. leader, and promised that help is on the way to Iranian protesters. On January 17th, Iranian state television released the first official death toll, reporting 3,117 people killed during the crackdown, with 2,427 described as civilians and security forces. However, independent organizations immediately disputed this figure, noting that Iran's theocracy has historically undercounted or simply not reported fatalities from unrest. By January 20th and 21st, the military dimension intensified dramatically. The USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group, which had been operating in the South China Sea, transited through the Strait of Malacca on January 20th, heading westward toward the Middle East. On January 23rd, President Trump confirmed to reporters at the World Economic Forum in Davos that the United States has a big force going towards Iran, describing it as an armada of warships. He added that maybe we won't have to use it, leaving both military action and diplomatic resolution as possibilities. Between January 24th and 25th, major European airlines, including Air France, KLM, and Lufthansa, suspended flights to Middle East destinations including Dubai, Tel Aviv, Riyadh, and Tehran, citing the geopolitical situation. The aviation industry's response reveals professional risk assessments indicating genuine war danger. These airlines aren't just avoiding Iranian airspace, they're clearing the entire region, suggesting intelligence indicates potential for widespread conflict. Then, on January 26th, U.S. Central Command confirmed that the Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group arrived in the Middle East, specifically positioning in the Indian Ocean, bringing thousands of additional service members to the region. The carrier strike group consists of the USS Abraham Lincoln with Carrier Air Wing 9 and 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, USS Spruance, USS Michael Murphy, and USS Frank E. Peterson, Jr. According to U.S. officials speaking to major American media outlets, the strike group had crossed into Central Command's area of responsibility, but as of January 27th had not yet reached its intended ultimate position, meaning it was still moving closer to Iran. Most dramatically, on January 27th, multiple sources confirmed the Iranian rial had collapsed to 1.5 million to the dollar, a record low that represents catastrophic economic devastation. Exchange shops in Tehran offered this rate while traders declined to speak publicly, with several responding angrily to the situation. Just a decade ago, the rial traded at 32,000 to the dollar, meaning Iranians have watched their savings lose 98% of their value. To understand why this crisis is so severe, we need to examine the broader context of U.S.-Iran relations and Iran's deteriorating internal situation. This current crisis cannot be understood without reference to what happened in June 2025. The U.S. and Israel struck Iran's nuclear program in what became known as the 12-Day War, targeting facilities at Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan. This operation, called Operation Midnight Hammer, significantly damaged Iran's nuclear infrastructure. In response, Iran struck a U.S. military base in Qatar, Al Udeid Air Base, though no personnel were injured. While the strikes damaged Iran's nuclear facilities, they did not eliminate Iran's missile capabilities or its command and control structures, leaving the regime intact but weakened and vulnerable. The root cause of the current protests is economic devastation. Due to decades of international sanctions, chronic mismanagement, and widespread corruption, the Iranian rial's value has nosedived and oil revenues have shrunk dramatically. The country suffers from electricity outages and chronic water shortages, making daily life increasingly difficult for average citizens. Workers earn approximately $100 a month while facing inflation exceeding 42% and food prices rising even faster than headline inflation. In September 2025, sanctions under the 2015 Iran nuclear deal came back into force, triggered by the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, who stated that Iran had been in significant non-performance with the agreement. These restored UN sanctions target Iran's nuclear and missile production, compounding existing economic pressures and accelerating the rial's collapse. Beyond economics, Iran's strategic position has deteriorated significantly. Established leaders of many Iran-backed armed groups have been eliminated, and their strength has weakened in regional conflicts. The fall of the Assad regime in Syria removed a key ally that had provided Iran with a critical land bridge to Lebanon and the Mediterranean. Both Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza face pressure to disarm following Israel's extensive military operations against them during the Gaza war. Iran's so-called axis of resistance, the network of proxy militant groups that provided a defensive buffer and power projection capability, has largely collapsed. President Trump has established specific conditions that have created what analysts describe as a diplomatic trap. Trump hinted he was about to strike Iran over what he characterized as Iran's brutal crackdown, though he toned down rhetoric after Gulf Arab nations pushed him to refrain from attacking Iran, a move they fear would plunge the region into chaos. Sources speaking to major news outlets revealed that Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, explicitly told Trump they want no part of strikes on Iran. They watched Iranian missiles hit Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar last June and know their oil infrastructure, cities, and economic lifelines sit exposed to potential Iranian retaliation. On January 23rd, Trump signaled that channels between Washington and Tehran were open, saying Iran does want to talk and will talk during his speech at the World Economic Forum. However, Trump simultaneously told reporters the strike group was en route to the Middle East and stated that we have a big force going toward Iran, adding that he would rather not see anything happen, but that we're watching them very closely. This dual-track approach of military pressure combined with diplomatic openings has left both sides uncertain about the other's ultimate intentions. Iran has a documented history of violently suppressing dissent, but the scale of the current crackdown appears to exceed anything in the Islamic Republic's modern history, prior to the 2025 through 2026 protests. Previous high death tolls included 72 protesters killed during the 2009 Iranian presidential election protests and between 300 and 1,500 deaths in the November 2019 protests. The current death toll, even using the most conservative verified figures, represents at least double the worst previous crackdown, with some estimates suggesting it could be 10 times worse. The nuclear dimension adds another layer of complexity and danger. In January 2026, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stated Israel will not allow Iran to re-establish its missile or nuclear programs. Trump echoed this position, stating that while the U.S. remains open to a deal with Iran, if Iran begins to re-establish its nuclear programs, we're going to have to knock them down. Iranian officials have claimed they've rebuilt damaged facilities. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stated Iran has reconstructed everything that was damaged in June 2025, though this claim cannot be independently verified and is disputed by Western intelligence assessments. The combination of economic collapse, regional isolation, renewed sanctions, the threat of military action, and the internet blackout has created what analysts across the political spectrum describe as one of Iran's most vulnerable moments since the 1979 revolution. The perspectives on this crisis reveal deep divisions and competing narratives about what's happening and what should happen next. Iranian authorities frame the protests and international response through the lens of foreign intervention and national sovereignty. Chief Justice Gholam Hossein Mohseni Ejei expressed dismay at calls for negotiations with the U.S. amid what he called an all-out war and economic blockade against Iran. Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei acknowledged on January 17 that several thousand people had been killed, but attributed the violence to protesters whom he blamed as terrorists working in line with U.S. and Israeli interests. According to Iranian state media, Khamenei stated on January 27 that he considers United States President Donald Trump a criminal for inflicting casualties, damage, and slander on the Iranian people during the protests. Tehran has issued stark warnings about military retaliation. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi wrote in the Wall Street Journal on January 27 that our powerful armed forces have no qualms about firing back with everything we have if we come under renewed attack. He added that an all-out confrontation will certainly be ferocious and drag on far, far longer than the fantasy timelines that some envision. Araghchi stated his warning was not a threat, but a reality he felt compelled to convey explicitly because, as both a diplomat and a veteran, he abhors war. In response to the carrier's arrival, Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Esmail Baghaei stated at a press conference on January 27 that Iran will give a comprehensive and regret-inducing response to any aggression. Tehran's municipality unveiled a giant billboard at Revolution Square showing a destroyed U.S. aircraft carrier with the message in both Farsi and English, "If you sow the wind, you will reap the whirlwind." This billboard, visible in photos from January 25 and 26, represents an unprecedented level of direct public messaging aimed at the United States. The Trump administration has oscillated between military threats and diplomatic openings. Trump's December 2025 national security strategy argues the U.S. should encourage and applaud reform in the Middle East when and where it emerges organically, without trying to impose it from without. However, Trump has also been explicit about military options. He stated his threatened military action would make last year's U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear sites look like peanuts if the government proceeded with planned executions of protesters. U.S. officials told the Wall Street Journal that Trump is weighing diplomacy against military strikes, but multiple sources indicate he's currently seeking what he calls decisive military options, though what decisive means remains subject to debate within his administration. Reports from Axios revealed that Trump came very close to ordering strikes in mid-January. According to 4 U.S. officials, 2 Israeli officials, and other sources with knowledge of the discussions, a strike plan was ready after Trump spoke with his senior team, and on one particular Wednesday there was serious expectation inside the administration and belief in capitals across the Middle East, including Iran, that Trump would greenlight the strike. U.S. troops began evacuating from Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar and the Navy's 5th Fleet Base in Bahrain. The Iranian regime was convinced a U.S. attack was coming and issued a notice closing its airspace. However, the order never came, due to insufficient military hardware in the region at that time, warnings from allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia, concern among top aides about the implications and effectiveness of the strike options, and secret back-channel talks with the Iranians. The international community has urged restraint. The International Crisis Group warned that U.S. threats of military intervention create additional dangers and urged Washington to offer major economic incentives in exchange for meaningful political change in Iran rather than military action. Amnesty International documented mass unlawful killings on an unprecedented scale and urged UN member states to convene special sessions at both the UN Human Rights Council and Security Council. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran stated the number of civilians killed may surpass 20,000, a figure that would make this one of the deadliest government crackdowns in modern history. Regional powers have taken notably cautious stances. As mentioned, Gulf Arab states pushed Trump to refrain from attacking Iran, fearing regional chaos and direct retaliation against their territories. Secretary of State Marco Rubio urged Iraq to keep distance from Iran amid heightened tensions, emphasizing that a government controlled by Iran cannot successfully put Iraq's own interests first. Iran-backed groups have signaled potential involvement. Abu Hussein al-Hamidawi, chief of Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, issued a warning of total war in case of U.S. aggression, while the Houthis in Yemen released a video showing U.S. warships as potential targets, though the credibility and capability of these threats remains debatable given both groups' weakened positions following Israeli operations. China's position has been notably restrained and calculated. During a January 12th press conference, the Chinese Foreign Ministry called on both the Iranian government and protesters to de-escalate tensions and restore stability. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said, "China pursues a foreign policy of forming partnerships rather than alliances, pointedly rejecting the possibility of offering Iran security guarantees. This represents a significant shift from previous crises where China provided more robust rhetorical support to Tehran. However, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi did tell Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi that China has consistently supported Iran's sovereignty and would continue to advocate for Iran's positions in international forums, including the UN Security Council. Multiple analysts note that while China won't provide military support, Chinese surveillance technology remains crucial to Iran's repression apparatus, with Chinese firms selling surveillance cameras and facial recognition software to Iran's security services. Human rights organizations have sounded urgent alarms. Iran Human Rights, known by its acronym IHRNGO, learned through sources within Iran's Ministry of Health that between January 8th and 12th alone, at least 3,379 protester deaths were registered, excluding deaths in military hospitals and cases where bodies were taken directly to morgues. The organization warned of serious risk of protester executions following show trials, noting that the judiciary stressed the need for swift trials and punishment. More than 41,800 people have been detained, according to activists, and their fate remains uncertain, with fears of mass executions similar to the 1980s when thousands were executed following show trials. The immediate military situation presents both significant capabilities and notable constraints. The deployment of the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group represents substantial offensive capability. The carrier's Air Wing 9 operates F/A-18E, F Super Hornets, EA-18G Growlers for electronic warfare, F-35C stealth fighter jets, E-2D advanced Hawkeye surveillance aircraft, and MH-60RS helicopters. The strike group includes 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers equipped with Tomahawk cruise missiles capable of striking targets deep inside Iran from distances exceeding 1,000 miles, and the Aegis combat system for air and missile defense. According to military analysts and confirmed by various defense publications, the Carrier Strike Group has approximately 5,000 crew members and can conduct sustained operations for months without requiring port visits, thanks to replenishment ships like the USNS Henry J. Kaiser that can transfer millions of gallons of fuel and thousands of tons of ordnance during underway replenishment operations. The carrier has reportedly deactivated its automatic identification system, making it difficult to track its precise location, a move typically undertaken when preparing for potential combat operations. However, operational challenges exist. As of late January 27th, the strike group was in the Indian Ocean, not yet in the Arabian Sea, which borders Iran, meaning it will need to move closer for maximum effectiveness. The carrier would need to position in the Arabian Sea or Persian Gulf approaches to minimize flight times for strike aircraft. Time magazine reported that right now, not a single U.S. carrier is patrolling the Persian Gulf itself, and any operation would depend partly on long-range assets or bases in countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, all of which have signaled reluctance to participate in strikes. Additionally, U.S. Central Command announced on January 27th that the U.S. 9th Air Force will conduct a multi-day readiness exercise to demonstrate its ability to deploy, disperse, and sustain combat air power across the Central Command theater. Lieutenant General Alexis Grinkowicz stated that our airmen are proving they can disperse, operate, and generate combat sorties under demanding conditions, safely, precisely, and alongside our partners. This exercise serves both as genuine preparation and as a signal to Iran of American capabilities. The aviation industry's response serves as perhaps the most telling barometer of actual war risk. The suspensions by Air France, KLM, and Lufthansa aren't merely about avoiding Iranian airspace. These airlines suspended flights to Dubai, Tel Aviv, Riyadh, and other regional hubs, essentially clearing commercial aviation from the entire region. This indicates professional risk assessments conclude there's genuine danger of a wider conflict that could affect airspace across multiple countries. The European Union Aviation Safety Agency issued warnings, and multiple national aviation authorities advised operators against entering Iranian airspace. The primary concern isn't just anti-aircraft fire, but the risk of misidentification of civil aircraft by air defense systems during periods of heightened tension, as tragically demonstrated by the shootdown of Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 in January 2020, which killed all 176 people aboard. The death toll controversy carries strategic importance beyond the humanitarian tragedy. Iran's official toll of 3,117 contrasts sharply with the U.S.-based human rights activist news agency count of 6,126 killed as of January 27, including 5,777 protesters, 214 government-affiliated forces, 86 children, and 49 civilians who weren't demonstrating. Rana notes it has an additional 12,904 deaths still under investigation, which could push the total significantly higher. More dramatically, Time magazine reported on January 25 that a German-Iranian surgeon provided hospital records showing 30,304 protest-related deaths, while Iran International estimated the number could exceed 36,500 based on multiple internal government reports. If accurate, these figures would make this crackdown comparable in scale to some of the worst massacres in modern history. The massive discrepancy provides political justification for international intervention while simultaneously demonstrating the regime's absolute determination to survive at any cost. The economic consequences compound the humanitarian crisis. Iranians across the country remain afflicted by the internet shutdown that entered its 20th day on January 27th. NetBlocks reported the blackout continues into its third week, despite brief momentary restorations. Online platforms are occasionally whitelisted, and some users have been able to tunnel out using VPNs or other circumvention tools over the last couple of days, but overall connectivity remains severely limited. The internet blockade has disrupted everyday life, including digital transactions and the functioning of hospitals, pharmacies, banks, and government bureaus. The currency collapse represents economic devastation on a scale difficult to comprehend. The rial falling from 32,000 to the dollar just 10 years ago to 1.5 million to the dollar today means someone who had savings equivalent to $10,000 a decade ago now has purchasing power of approximately $213. Iran has offered the equivalent of $7 a month to most people in the country to cover rising costs, but this does virtually nothing to address the catastrophic loss of purchasing power. Some currency platforms began displaying the rial's value as $0.00, not because the currency is officially worthless, but due to rounding limitations in digital systems not designed to handle such extreme depreciation. Iran's parliament approved a redenomination plan in October 2025, proposing to remove 4 zeros from the rial, but officials described this as merely an accounting reset, not a cure for the underlying inflation or currency weakness. The crisis is reshaping Middle East security dynamics in profound ways. Analysts uniformly agree that China and Russia will not provide significant defense or security support to Iran during this crisis, echoing their limited responses to the June 2025 U.S. and Israel military strikes. This leaves Iran more isolated than in previous confrontations. The fall of Assad's Syria removed a key buffer state and Iran's primary land corridor for supplying Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iran-backed groups like Hamas and Hezbollah face intense pressure to disarm following devastating losses in recent conflicts with Israel, fundamentally weakening Iran's regional deterrence posture. Despite military posturing, diplomatic channels remain active, creating a complex picture of intentions. Trump confirmed on January 11th that Iran reached out to the United States to propose negotiations for a nuclear deal. Two sources told Axios that Iranian Foreign Affairs Minister Abbas Araghchi contacted U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to de-escalate tensions or buy more time before potential U.S. military action. However, fundamental disagreements persist. Iran has refused to negotiate its ability to enrich uranium, support what it calls the axis of resistance, and develop its ballistic missile program, which are precisely the three core issues the U.S. wants addressed. Without movement on these issues, any negotiation faces enormous obstacles. The nuclear question remains central to the entire crisis. Iran continues to be in dispute with the International Atomic Energy Agency over allowing monitoring of its nuclear program and resolving safeguarding issues that have been outstanding for years. Whether Iran has actually rebuilt its damaged nuclear facilities following the June 2025 strikes remains unverified. Western intelligence agencies express skepticism about Iranian claims of full reconstruction, but the perception that Iran is attempting to rebuild creates pressure for preventive action before significant progress is made. The next 48 to 72 hours could prove decisive. The carrier strike group has arrived in the Middle East, but military sources confirm it has not reached its intended ultimate position, meaning it continues moving closer to Iran. Once fully positioned in the Arabian Sea or Gulf of Oman, it will provide Trump with readily available strike capability that can be executed with minimal additional preparation time. Aviation industry behavior will continue to signal professional risk assessment. If airlines extend flight suspensions beyond current temporary measures or if additional carriers suspend operations, it will indicate intelligence assessments increasingly favor imminent military action. Conversely, if airlines begin announcing plans to resume Middle East services, it would signal confidence that immediate war risk has diminished. Diplomatic activity continues behind the scenes despite public rhetoric. Multiple sources confirm that channels between Washington and Tehran remain open through intermediaries, though whether these represent genuine negotiation opportunity or tactical delay remains unclear. The fact that Trump came very close to ordering strikes in mid-January but pulled back suggests he's genuinely weighing options rather than having already decided on a course of action. Several critical questions remain unanswered. Will Trump actually order strikes? He appears emboldened by what his administration considers the tactical success of operations in January 2026 and impressed by the size and persistence of Iran's protests. He has repeatedly threatened action and clearly wants to be seen as different from his predecessors, who he believes showed weakness toward Iran. However, Gulf Arab nations have explicitly pushed him to refrain, and his own advisors have raised concerns about the effectiveness of limited strikes and the risk of wider escalation. What are China's true intentions? While China has offered only lukewarm rhetorical support and explicitly rejected providing security guarantees, Chinese technology remains crucial to Iran's repression apparatus. Chinese firms continue selling surveillance cameras and facial recognition software to Iran's security services, technology that has been instrumental in identifying and tracking protesters even during the internet blackout when images and videos eventually leak out. Can the Iranian regime survive without fundamental changes? Without a deal with the U.S. to lift sanctions, Iran faces the prospect of continued economic deterioration and further unrest. The regime has reasserted control for now through overwhelming force, but economic conditions haven't improved and may worsen if the currency continues collapsing. Supreme Leader Khamenei is 85 years old, and succession questions loom over a regime that has lost legitimacy in the eyes of large segments of its population, particularly younger Iranians. What about the threat of mass executions? Trump claimed on multiple occasions that Iran halted the hangings of 800 detained protesters, though he has not provided sources for this claim, which Iran's top prosecutor called completely false. More than 41,800 people have been detained, according to activists. Iranian authorities have broadcast at least 40 forced confessions from detention facilities on state television, including confessions from minors, raising grave concerns about due process and the treatment of detainees. History suggests that periods of relative calm following Iranian protest movements have often been followed by waves of executions. Will regional actors intervene? Iran-backed groups in Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon have signaled they may attack U.S. and Israeli interests if conflict breaks out, potentially widening any confrontation. However, these groups are significantly weaker than in previous years. The question is whether they retain enough capability to pose meaningful threats, or whether their warnings represent desperate attempts at deterrence from positions of weakness. Looking at likely timelines, the next 1 to 3 days represent the current phase where military assets continue positioning and diplomatic backchannels remain active. Aviation industry behavior will be monitored continuously. Days 4 through 7 constitute a decision window for the Trump administration. Either a diplomatic breakthrough emerges, or military action becomes increasingly likely as assets reach optimal positioning and the political window for action narrows. Weeks 2 through 4 will depend entirely on whether military action occurs. If it doesn't, focus shifts to Iran's internal stability and whether protests re-emerge as the regime attempts to normalize the situation. If military action does occur, regional response and conflict management become paramount concerns. Key indicators to monitor include aviation industry flight scheduling decisions beyond current suspensions, movement of additional U.S. military assets such as B-2 bombers or additional carrier strike groups, Iranian defensive preparations and rhetoric escalation patterns, the status and substance of diplomatic channels, behavior of Iran-backed groups in Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon, oil market reactions which would reflect trader assessments of war risk, and Chinese and Russian positioning at the UN Security Council, where either could block resolutions but might also signal their level of support for Iran. To summarize the current situation, Iran faces its most serious crisis since the 1979 revolution. Between December 28, 2025, and late January 2026, protests against economic collapse evolved into nationwide anti-government upheaval met with devastating force. The death toll ranges from Iran's official figure of 3,117 to independent estimates exceeding 30,000 people, making this potentially one of the deadliest government crackdowns in modern history. In response, the United States deployed the USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group to the Middle East, arriving on January 26th. President Trump has described this as an armada and threatened strikes if Iran executes protesters, while simultaneously leaving room for diplomatic resolution. Major international airlines suspended flights across the region weeks ago and have not resumed, indicating professional risk assessments conclude genuine war danger persists. Iran's currency collapsed to a record low of 1.5 million rials to the dollar on January 27, devastating the purchasing power of ordinary Iranians and compounding the economic grievances that sparked the protests. However, diplomatic channels remain open despite escalatory rhetoric from both sides. Iran has reached out for negotiations, though fundamental disagreements on nuclear enrichment, missile programs, and regional influence remain unresolved. Gulf Arab nations have urged restraint, explicitly telling the Trump administration they don't want to be part of strikes on Iran, fearing their own vulnerability to retaliation and regional devastation. The coming days will determine whether this crisis resolves through diplomacy or explodes into military confrontation. What's certain is that Iran's economic collapse and political instability will continue regardless of immediate outcomes. The combination of economic devastation, regional isolation, and internal upheaval has created conditions that cannot be quickly resolved even if immediate military conflict is avoided. This is a developing story with profound implications for regional stability, global energy markets, and international security. The decisions made in the next few days by leaders in Washington, Tehran, and regional capitals will shape the Middle East for years to come. As we've seen throughout this crisis, the situation can change dramatically within hours, making continued monitoring essential for understanding this pivotal moment. The humanitarian crisis continues with thousands dead, tens of thousands detained, and millions of Iranians suffering under economic conditions that worsen by the day. The internet blackout persists, limiting information flow and making independent verification of events extremely difficult. Whatever happens next, the Iranian people have paid an enormous price for demanding change in their country. I'll continue monitoring this situation closely and will provide updates as significant developments occur. This crisis represents a critical juncture not just for U.S.-Iran relations, but for the entire Middle East security architecture. Understanding the full complexity of what's happening requires attention to military, economic, diplomatic, and humanitarian dimensions simultaneously.